So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please stick your hand in the air. But I'm going to start by asking a question from the floor to pick up on a number of things that some of our panelists have said. Steve, you mentioned the portrayal of business and corporations in popular culture. I don't claim to have any recommendation about what I can do about this. But with the exception of, say, Rand and her novels, it does seem that Hollywood, the British theatre, much of popular culture is incredibly leftist and statist. Why is this the case? It seems to me that if you were to pick out, if you like, a range of libertarian movies, they'd often be dystopian science fiction, which kind of gives the impression that in 500 years' time, it might be rational to fight back against the government, but nothing's particularly wrong now. But in 500 years' time, it will be even in my beloved series Doctor Who, there was an episode in 2005 based around a hospital in the Blitz, and the doctor saves everybody and ends by saying something along the lines of, I'm glad I've saved everybody because that now allows you to set up the National Health Service. I nearly destroyed my entire DVD collection of Doctor Who when I heard that single sentence. So my question to you, Steve, is why is this the case? Why is it that statists seem to have an enormously greater share of popular culture than those of a classical liberal persuasion?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a full explanation for it. I'd qualify the kind of rather bleak survey Mark just gave us in a couple of ways. The first is that this has not always been the case. If you look back at the 19th century, for example, many of the greatest artists, authors of the time, composers and so on, were in fact ardent classical liberals. So Giuseppe Verdi, for example, ardent liberal, and this comes across very powerfully in many of his works, even works that you might not think are overtly concerned with political ideas or philosophy. Rigoletto, for example, is basically about the corrupting effects of power and what this does to people. And there's lots of other examples of that. Something happened to what you might call high culture in the early part of the 20th century. It's particularly marked, though, in some genres, because that's the second qualification I would make. Certain genres of popular literature, for example, like science fiction most notably, but also the genre of the thriller and other things of that kind, are far less dominated by this kind of collectivist, anti-trade mindset than are sort of mainstream fiction, or above all, film. And really, it's film and television where we're talking most dramatically about this kind of bias and prejudice. Why is this the case? I suspect that it has to do with actually something quite concrete and specific and contingent, and that is the social milieu out of which most of the world's, or at least the Western world's, films, television are created. And you have to realize that it's actually a relatively small group of people, class of people, who produce the bulk of this kind of artistic product. And I think it's the internal beliefs, attitudes, mutually reinforced beliefs and attitudes of that section of people that lead to this kind of thing. And now, in a way, that's actually quite reassuring, because it means that just as we had a kind of huge turnover at the very end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, so you can expect a change over here. The thing to do is to go out there and actually create the cultural and artistic forms that will articulate a different set of views and also do it well. Because what you don't want, of course, is to produce, I mean, quite apart from dystopian films, you also do get some kind of libertarian films which are up there in the kind of Ed Wood movie category of really bad films, and that's not what you want to do.
Harry, you wanted to come up?
Let me give you a view of the philosophy of history that does explain this. If Christianity leads to communism, and it does, and that's what Marx basically was doing, was making a secularized version of Christianity. I mean, just read the Sermon on the Mount. The meek will inherit the earth. The proletariat will rise up and exploit the exploited. It's the same basic philosophy. From each according to his ability, to each is according to his need, is a right out of the Bible's hatred for the rich. So if the Christianity leads to communism, domination, totalitarian theocracy of some kind as it did, how did we get out of it? Well, the influence of Christianity began to wane. We had the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and by about 1688, to pick a year, in England, the received view was man has some self-seeking motives, which are proper in their place, and he has some, quote, benevolent motives, which was the philosopher's idea of what altruism means. So we have a compromise between selfishness and selflessness in England, which was a lot better than what we had before. On that basis, Locke was able to come up with the theory of rights, John Locke, of course. And that held for a while, but then there was a counterattack from Germany. Immanuel Kant and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Kant and Hegel, erected a structure of ideas based upon the mind's inability to know reality, the worthlessness of the individual, the need to merge into a collective, sacrifice above all to the collective. Unfortunately, that swept the world because it had clever arguments in its support. As that resurgence of a actually selflessness, mystical, anti-reason philosophy took over, freedom waned. And the universities now are totally Kantian Hegelian. They may not be explicitly so, but they hold all the premises. They are 100% in favor of altruism, and of course the products of the universities, the intellectuals and the media people, of course, hold the same philosophy as their professors. So it's the ideas of the German philosophers that have to be rebutted in order to take the stain, the moral stain, off of freedom and replace it with the honor that it's due.
I'll come over to the floor in just a minute. I want to bring Matthew in before I do. So do wave your hand in the air. I'm very myopic, so you're going to have to stick going. Grant, are you able to pick out some of these people? I'll come to you in 1 second. I just wanted to bring Matthew in and maybe some of the other panelists about this debate or other assertion that Harry made. We haven't debated it yet. About to what extent do the panelists believe that libertarians should indeed talk about the poor? One of the things that I've noticed in many, if not most, of the sort of short media debates that I've taken part in, where you can't really get much more than a sort of soundbite in, is that very often those who are arguing the classical liberal view are portrayed or assumed to be on the side of big business, possibly even on the side of crony capitalism. And whoever you're speaking against, whether it's somebody from a charity or a state-funded charity or a trade unionist, is assuming to be holding the banner for the oppressed underdog. The poorer people, if not the more deserving, certainly the more needy. And one of the things that the IAs sought to do around the fairly controversial debate about welfare reform and the cost of living that we're having in Britain at the moment is not so much to assert that the poor should be the absolutely number one priority, but to explain that the poor are as undermined by the state as the rich. That the reason that there is a cost of living crisis is in no small part down to state intervention. Planning restrictions are forcing up the price of property. If you're in the lowest 20% of the population's income stream here in the UK, and you smoke an average number of cigarettes, which I think is about 8 a day, drink the weekly recommended allowance of alcohol, but not a drop more, and drive a car the average distance, about 30% of your income is taken just in sin taxes by the government. There seems to be a state assault on those of fairly minimal means rather than a corporate assault. So do you think, I'd like to know the panelists' views on whether you think there's any case at all that libertarians, or even certain libertarians, should try and reframe their arguments to show that the policies that we're putting forward are good for Joe Schmo, or even indeed good for somebody who is a little bit below Joe Schmo in income and wealth. Matthew?
I think we definitely should. I just want to pick up on some of the things that Harry said. And I'm a huge fan of Ayn Rand. Own first editions of Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead and love her novels and what have you. And so they are. And I love her works. But I must say, when you publish a work called The Virtue of Selfishness, the idea that that can actually get through to the public and actually sort of convince them of your ideas is going to happen. You don't have to be an expert in sort of messaging to know that if you go on the radio or on TV and what have you and sort of say, I believe in selfishness, it ain't going to work. And, similarly, I think that when you try and I'm getting very deep water, I'm just a campaigner, I'm not like an academic or a theologian or anything like that. But again, sort of trying to sort of paint the fact that, Christians can't be libertarians, for example. I think there are two ways of reading, the Bible, for example. And, if you take the story of the Good Samaritan, some people like yourself may say that with the Good Samaritan, that means you must have a welfare state, you must help everybody, have high taxes, high spending, high welfare and what have you. I quite like it when sort of Margaret Thatcher picks up on the fact that actually, who was it who could help the poor guy? It was the Samaritan who happened to be the businessman. I like that fact that she was actually showing how it could actually be the business person who made some money, who was a person in a position to help people. So moving on to Mark's point, I think we have a very positive case to make that actually we do want to help people in society, but how do we go about and do that? We actually do it through free markets, creating wealth, and then allowing people to use their own money to actually help people, through charity. And I really respect the business people I work alongside a lot, who actually make fortunes in the city, make fortunes from manufacturing, all aspects of the economy, but they don't hoard up all their money and just sort of keep it in a big safe. They actually use it for charitable purposes, and I actually really admire them for that.
I'm going to kind of both endorse what Matthew says and also qualify to disagree with it slightly. I do think that the kind of vocabulary that you use is enormously important. That's a basic kind of point in communication. I endorse that part of it completely. I think it is important that libertarians are seen to be addressing the issue of the poor, if you will, or the less advantaged, whatever you want to call it. There are three basic kind of points, I think, that you need to make in this connection. The first is to actually put across, I put my historian's hat on here, the basic historical point that for the greater part of human history, the normal default condition for all human beings was utter abject poverty. The United Nations, well-known neoliberal organization and all that, but reckons that in 1820, 80% of the world's population were living on the then equivalent of $1.50 a day. We are now at the situation where it's less than 15%. So one of the points to make is that, in fact, we are living in a period where poverty has gone from being the normal state of affairs for most people to being a rare and exceptional thing. Still too much of it, but it's on the way down. And as Matthew said, what you make is the argument that the best way of helping the poor is economic growth. Create more wealth through productive activity. That's the way to do it. And a famous line of this from a well-known, actually, IEA friend of the IEA, Peter Bauer, he was once asked to respond to a program that John Kenneth Galbraith had made about poverty, and his response was, poverty has no causes, wealth has causes. And that's a very profound insight. Poverty is natural, it's the default condition. The other thing is this, and this is where I would slightly depart from what Matthew says. I don't think you should emphasize charity so much. The thing to emphasize is the forgotten tradition of mutual aid. collective self-help, where people on average or low incomes get together on a voluntary basis to mutually support each other and help each other out. We used to have an enormous range of institutions in this country, some of which still survive. I'm a member in good standing of the Odd Fellows, for example, which delivered a huge range of social services. And this wasn't charity. This was putting money into a pot, pooling resources to provide mutual aid and assistance by right because you were a contributor. But also, and this is a very important point, there were obligations that came with making that contribution. You were expected to behave, basically, and to conduct yourself in a way that meant you would not get into trouble. So there was strong reciprocal contribution and obligation. That's the kind of vision that has almost been completely forgotten, and that's what we need to say, that what you're talking about, as I say, is not in stand by yourself, but collective, but strictly voluntary self-help and action.
Very, very quickly, Harry, then I want to bring in some people.
I don't entirely disagree with what you're saying. It's not that one should refuse to ever discuss the effect of capitalism on the poor, but the way I think is very important to do it is not to concede the premise that need is a claim to the lives of others. If Ayn Rand used to answer this question by saying, if you want to help the poor, the only way to do that is to leave the producers free to produce the wealth that everyone, including the poor, benefits from. So it's not, oh, well, we've got to help the poor. That's a given. As to the effectiveness of selling the virtue of selfishness, let me point out that it sold 4 to 5 million copies in the US, and every word Ayn Rand ever wrote was a defense of selfishness, and as I said, 25 million books have been sold since she began writing. So it does play well. I have a list of the prominent people in America who credit Ayn Rand for giving them their basic orientation. But I don't know how many of those are known here. For instance, Senator Rand Paul, you know his name? A presidential candidate probably in the next election. Paul Ryan, the head of the Budget Committee. Ted Cruz, Ron Johnson, Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who before he was on the court, would have all of his law clerks watch the movie version of The Fountainhead. Every year, his law clerks would watch that, and he's very influenced by Ayn Rand. Alan Greenspan, who jettisoned it, was a personal close friend of Ayn Rand's and got the ideas that he used to advocate from her. The head of Cato is a dedicated objectivist. The Ayn Rand Society in the American Philosophical Association has 50 members, professional philosophers. So we are having a tremendous influence based upon selling self-interest, selfishness. And I think it's at minimum, if you don't want to sell selfishness, don't sell self-sacrifice, because we can't win on the premise of self-sacrifice.
Thanks. Let's bring in Grant. Have you picked some questions? Yeah. If you could say who you are for the benefit of the audience.
I'm Edward Anderson, and it leads in quite well. I'm a member of the Labour Party, so you can hate me all afterwards. I want to come back to, it leads indirectly to what Steve said about mutuals. You don't hear anything about that at all, and one of the main reasons why I was attracted to come here was not because of an obsession with selfishness, but precisely because the Labour Party cannot and has chosen not to really help the poor in this country. So if you're going to march under a banner which says, I don't care about the poor, basically everyone in the Labour Party would love you to do that, because you'll get annihilated at every single election. I thought the point was about this, is that you believe that this was the greatest way to help the most people, that you could see it as a moral crusade to help the poor. That's how you can do it. My question towards Steve is, you talk a lot about the old working class mutuals, absolutely, in the self-help societies, and you could almost see trusts in terms of housing trusts as an example of that. My point would be, and a criticism of this, and a lot of politics in general, is that the people that you are attracted here will tend to be quite middle class, well off, And if you're against charity, the people who are going to lead that change and who are going to create these institutions again are probably not going to be the people sitting in this room, but they're going to be a different audience of working class people which you somehow simply have not been able to attract. Maybe it's because you don't go on about mutuals, or maybe it's because these events, the people who are going to lead that change will not be the people here, they'll be the people who actually work in working class jobs, not well-off academics.
Cheers. As another statist, I was wondering, do you not sort of tying in the first two questions together?
Who are you?
Oh, sorry, James Anderson. I work for the government. I was. You were saying that it's popular culture that makes people think that business are a ruthless, just a collection of ruthless organizations. Do you not think that it's actually current affairs that happen around them? I mean, companies avoiding paying billions in corporation tax. And then following on from that, do you not think that that serves to make people skeptical about people's inherent capacity for private charity or collective action or whatever you'd call it?
Okay. Can you see if there are any actual libertarians?
Hi, my name's Simon Gibbs. I run a blog and a meetup called Libertarian Home. And I'm an objectivist. Several points I could make. I will plug the list of institutions that we could go about building, which I posted on Libertarian Home this morning. But one of the best things Libertarian Home ever did was organise a secret meeting with representatives from media organisations representing about 50 to 100,000 circulation. And we sat down with the Aaron Brook and worked out some ideas about how to make the case for selfishness. And one of the ones that came up, which I quite liked, was to review books or review pieces of art that embody the ideals of selfishness and the related ideals of justice and productivity that come out of it. And another one would be to focus on sports people. For example, I'm no psychologist and I've never met the guy, but I pretty much guarantee you that Andy Murray did not win Wimbledon for someone else. Andy Murray won Wimbledon and put a hell of a lot of effort into that. I mean, the guy almost died on the court. He did it for himself, and he should be held up, and rightly was held up as a hero for doing that. There wasn't a question, it was just those points.
Okay, well, let me come back to the panel. Harry, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Matthew and Steve. So, three different, questions or thoughts there. The institutions, what sort of people will set them up? How much of the tax avoidance question came up? And who are the sort of contemporary heroes that one can point to?
I want to reply to the statist. Yeah. It shows that philosophy, ideology governs the conclusions one makes, because you say, well, what about the sins of businesses? Maybe they are responsible for the bad view of business. What about the sins of government, which are 10,000 times bigger? Even the best government, the corruption, the favoritism, the cronyism, the power lust. What about that? That doesn't lead people to say, oh, it leads us to say it, but it doesn't lead the people we're talking about to say government is a malevolent force that has to be tamed. It leads us to say that. But it's the philosophy. Business is bad because they're selfish. They're greedy. That's why people hold that business is bad. Government is good because it works on the principle of collective sacrifice. It's noble. That's what governs people. Incidentally, I advocate selfishness not because it works, that is, it sells, not as propaganda, but because it's true. Man does live for his own sake, or should.
Just on a few of the points. First of all, the idea that we're all sort of middle-class libertarians and what have you. I think it's quite noticeable, actually, if you look at people in the sort of wider conservative family, those people actually believe in the ideas of classical liberalism and what have you, and free markets and that sort of thing, don't tend to be the people who have come from sort of middle-class backgrounds. Thinking about the people I've employed over the years in the various campaigns, there aren't a great deal of sort of old Etonians through the ranks. Most of them have actually come up from pretty sort of poor backgrounds. So actually I think the people driving forward this debate do tend to be from backgrounds which aren't the sort of most elite. On the tax avoidance point, I'll pick up on that as well. The best way to change that is to simplify the whole system. We've done great work at the TPA actually explaining how you could actually do that. And if you actually really simplified it and actually brought down rates as well, you see the coffers in the Treasury sort of go right up. So that's why I think we need to push for the tax simplification to take on the tax avoidance point.
Yeah. I agree with both of the points the previous panel members have made. Addressing a couple of points directly. The question about, yes, these kind of institutions are being created, actually, or recreated by all sorts of people in all kinds of places, parts of, rather rundown and sometimes rather grim parts of the world. It's a response to challenges. The question is, what is the kind of intellectual toolkit that people have? Now, 100 years ago, there was this extremely powerful tradition within the working class movement of mutualism, mutual self-help, collective action to alleviate poverty. And it was associated with quite sophisticated political thought, people like G.D.H. Cole. That has all gone now, really. Lots and lots of people are trying to reinvent the wheel. So what I am not advocating, never, 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 is what you might call a kind of de haut en bas approach, where people who are from a more privileged background but have the ideas go out and sort of instruct other people how to do it. That's a recipe for disaster, as well as being totally condescending and wrong for all sorts of reasons. What I'm saying, though, is that we need to simply do things ourselves. I think, if you want to actually change the world, it's not just a matter of advocating ideas. You should actually go out and create institutions yourself. And secondly, that what we need to do is to actually bring those ideas back into the public consciousness so people become aware that there isn't a stark choice between the welfare state and charity. And I actually think the welfare state is basically nationalised charity. There's also this whole other range of ways of dealing with things. And about the whole point about business, well, I don't think that the actions of business that most people come across are going to lead them to have an idea that business is predatory. When you think about it, this is simple nonsense. If you're trying to stay in business, by selling products to your customer, you're not going to stay in business or be at all successful if you actually prey on your customers and clients. You're going to go bust. The problem is that we have crony capitalism. We have businesses, firms, which are hand in glove, deeply in bed with the political class, and which are then, for example, like many of the financial services companies, bailed out when they get things wrong. That is the root of the problem. As far as tax avoidance goes, I agree with what Matthew says. I mean, tax avoidance is legal. The reason why companies can avoid tax legally is because the tax code is so damned complicated. We have the most complicated tax system in the world, apart from the United States. I forget how many pages is it? It's like 12, yeah, it's the longest in the world. So that's one of the areas where Britain is top nation, and we really wish it weren't, basically.
Okay, let's take some more questions. There's a couple of fronts.
Hello, Damien Mercier, independent economist. A couple of general points, possibly first to Steve and then latterly to Matthew. I was going to say, I think it's very hard. The left has just had generations of better PR. A phrase from the 40s, I just had to look it up to identify who it came from. Local councillor, politician, originally from Liverpool, my hometown, James Larkin came out with the phrase, "The great appear great to us because we are on our knees. Let us rise." Now, this was in reference to the moneyed classes. And, it doesn't take any of us here. We're all, well, okay, there is a presence of the man in the room, as admitted earlier on. But generally, we're on a similar sort of page. To switch that from the moneyed classes to the huge expansion of government, phenomenal expansion of government. Secondly, to Matthew, many of us, again here, have been involved in various campaigns, lots of grassroots politicking, as well as the academic side, in terms of trying to put policies, procedures, ideas, proposals to government. And when our putative partner in government, for instance, I'm thinking specifically of Cameron, came out a few years ago, going to wherever he went, Alaska or something, with Huskies, green radicalist, and then a couple of months back it comes out with the phrase in terms of reducing VAT on the energy bills, let's get rid of the green crap. I think it behoves us on the campaigning side to better understand how to navigate circumspection. Because I feel, for one, that they just catch us out constantly. Thank you.
Sorry. Brent Cowgill, I'm just an individual. This question is for Harry. Yesterday you talked a bit about package deals, and it occurred to me that this idea of charity, when it's done by government, might be a package deal. You know, there's force involved. Charity typically is you get money or you get a cause and then you distribute it. But the essence of force, I think, invalidates the idea of charity. Is that right? Is there another word that we can use for this government charity? Or cheers. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question for Harry as well.
Can you say who you are?
Anna. I'm Anna Hidalgo. I'm a graduate trainee. So basically, well, I am personally sympathetic to the philosophical, theoretical idea of rational selfishness. I'm much more uncomfortable with how you would pragmatize this idea. So, because it is such a pure, uncompromising view that you take, my question is, would you ever be willing to kind of either work for the government or lobby against the government to kind of scale back the government I'm just worried about the transition to that world that you are defending, because unless you pack your bags and go to New Hampshire or whatever, I'm not sure how you would put into practice your ideals.
Okay, Harry, let me start with you, particularly on that point, on the transitional point, and then I'll hand to Matthew and Steve, who can pick up some of those threads as well.
Well, the transition has to be gradual. It's not a Marxist, breaking of the shell of the old order. But the ideas have to be pure and uncompromised. So what you say is, the ideal is no state interference. This particular bill would move us in that direction. It would lessen state interference a little bit. That's a good thing. So you get your your sense of direction from pure uncompromised ideas. You know where you want to go. And the concrete proposals are evaluated in terms of, do they move in that direction or away from that direction? So gradualism is the political implementation of movement towards the ultimate uncompromised ideal. The other question was, is it a package? You'll talk about state charity. Well, yes, it is. And there are many terms for the dole or entitlement or loot is a good term to use, parasitism. But yes, it's not charity. But I have to say that we're being suckered here. The left is not really interested in the poor. So our argument, look, we can handle the poor. In fact, they're better off with us than they are with you. The left is not interested in the poor. What is my evidence for that? Two things. India and China, as I mentioned yesterday, have increased the lot of the poor 10 times anything any Western government has ever done in the last 50 years anyway, not by charity, but by instituting semi-capitalism. The left doesn't care about that, right? You don't see the left saying, well, maybe we should look at India and China. They're so advanced over what they were. No, there's silence. They don't care about that. The other thing is the whole environmental movement. What is the environmental movement? Ayn Rand analyzed it in 1969 as, when it became clear that only capitalism would produce wealth, the left abandoned the idea that wealth was good. The old Marxists said that socialism and communism would bring the riches, and they derided pie in the sky in favor of pie on earth when it became clear that capitalism provides the pie and socialism doesn't. They said pie's no good. So, look at the indifference of the environmentalists who are all leftists. It's the same thing, right? Look at the indifference they have to what, say, carbon tax system will do to the poor countries. They don't care. So it doesn't help to say capitalism really helps the poor. They know that. They're after punishing the rich. That's the motivation.
Matthew and Steve, I'll bring in as well. I just want to underscore Damien's point on the PR side. One of the things that frustrates me somewhat is it does seem, although we've intimated it already on this panel, that while big businesses or corporations or bankers might be sort of unpopular in the public eye, politicians and bureaucrats are more unpopular than they have ever been before. So it does seem to me that those who are arguing against politicians and bureaucrats shouldn't be feeling, which it does sometimes feel like, that we're pushing water uphill. We're, if you like, picking on a very unpopular enemy. What more can we do on the PR side to maximise that most people in the country mistrust or even loathe politicians and bureaucrats?
So on Damien's point, on the green crap and Cameron's attitude towards the environment, I think it's quite interesting. When he first became leader of the Conservative Party, a big theme in the whole of advertising in the country and what have you, because this was after like a decade worth of growth and prosperity and what have you, we had turned to the green agenda, and he was very much reflecting what advertisers and supermarkets and everybody was picking up on in terms of the environment. And then post-financial crisis, there was then a change in the mood when it came to the wider culture and advertising, what have you, towards value for money. So you'd see sort of Tesco or Sainsbury's moving from talking about what they're doing for the environment or how they're forcing people to pay for plastic bags to talking about value for money and how they're providing good value for money for households. I think Cameron's transition from being very sort of pro-environmentalist to now talking about green crap is a wider reflection of that. So I think he is somebody who does pay very close attention to what, should we say, the polls are saying and that sort of thing. Now, what does that mean for us as a liberty movement? We need to be here to actually provide those sort of fundamental arguments to help shift culture so politicians move in our favour. So, for example, I've been very influenced by, back in the early 2000s, by some of the writings of Julian Morris and Matt Ridley for the IEA on the environment. And now you sort of see the Global Warming Policy Foundation do great work on this issue with Nigel Lawson as well. Matt Sinclair, when he was at the TPA, wrote some really, really good research papers and a book on this issue as well. We've seen it down to more a grassroots level with Rob Halfon and his campaign against increasing fuel duty. So I think all of us in what we do, we can actually shift that public culture. So then politicians who tend to be sort of ciphers and respond to what public culture is, they'll move in our direction.
To respond again to Damien, first of all, I'd strongly support what Mark said earlier. The British public at the moment, and I think the publics in many Western countries, are deeply disillusioned with most institutions across the board, actually. Now, in some ways, that's quite alarming. But the good news is it means they're deeply sceptical of claims that politics is going to make the world a better place or bring about real social improvement. That can only be good if your aim is to reduce the scope of politics, essentially. Now, the other thing is, and this is where the kind of work that Matthew's been doing is very important, is to realise that the ideas, the philosophy, the ideology, if you will, that lies behind a lot of the current state and the way the state works is one which most people actually reject very strongly. And so to the degree that you can actually clarify through campaigning and through political dialogue what the underlying principles and the conflict of principle is, the stronger you become. So, for example, what is the basic philosophy underlying the welfare state? Well, it's a view which is actually the predominant one amongst political philosophers, and that is that none of us really own our income. The idea is that the wealth you create through your work and through trade, your income, your gross income, actually belongs to society as a whole. And you have no right, legal or otherwise, to your gross income. You only have a right to what's left after the collectivity in the form of the state has taken it off you. In other words, you only have a legal right to your net income. And there are people like, say, Richard Murphy, for example, who are prepared to blurt this out honestly, really. He's not very bright in my view, but let's not dwell on that. And the point is, if you actually put that view to the great majority of the public, there's something like 85% are utterly, totally opposed to that and find it a completely repugnant idea. So to the extent that you can actually clarify what the intellectual, theoretical basis of a lot of current policy is, you will actually win the argument, hands down, because the ideas upon which much of the current state is based are ideas which are, with good reason, rejected by the overwhelming majority of the population, which is why, I think the kind of work that Matthew and the organisations he's been involved with over the years has been doing is so important and ultimately so effective. For us.
Hi, my name is Danny Weston. 3 quick points. First one addressed to our friend from the Labour Party. I just wanted to say I'm a working class awake. Sorry to piss on your bonfire. Sorry to play the game of Prolio and Val. Born and bred in Dagenham. The Labour Party doesn't represent me or my family, and nor could it. 2 quick points to Harry. You said that Ayn Rand was the foremost philosopher promoting the virtue of selfishness, and you also, correct me if I'm wrong, implied that German philosophers tend to line up behind Hegel and Kant. I don't think either claim's true. Prior to Ayn Rand, there was Friedrich Nietzsche, who was an absolutely formidable promoter of individualism and enemy of collectivism, and one of his contemporaries, Max Stirner, promoted the philosophy of egoism. He's a highly consistent philosopher. If people haven't read him who are fans of Rand, I'd actually highly recommend reading his book, The Ego in Its Own.
I think one of the... Oh yeah, sure. I'm Alistair, University of Birmingham. I think to convince a lot of libertarians in the contemporary situation, what you need to do is provide a historical example where libertarianism has actually come into the government and the government has actually rolled back in size or spending. And I think one of the best ways you could do that is by libertarians infiltrating a local mafia, since they procure their wealth in the same way, and actually turning that into a charity. And if you could do that, then I think a lot of people would be convinced that libertarianism could actually be done through government.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Eleanor, student, University of Oxford. This is mostly a quick question for Harry. Isn't there a sort of fundamental, a performative contradiction? Like, isn't there a sort of inconsistency in advocating selfishness if you are yourself sort of an egoist ethically, in the sense that it surely benefits you for everybody else to be an altruist? So evangelizing about it is there not sort of some fundamental contradiction there?
Should we get one more in?
Guy Bentley, City AM. Thank you all so much for your fantastic talk so far. But just very quickly, just to clarify what we've been talking about in the discussion, what, in each of you, is the state of play of public opinion at the moment vis-a-vis libertarianism? And what are the particular issues in which we look like we might be having some success? It looks like on certain issues, immigration seems a really... Libertarians are now pretty much the only pro-immigration political movement. The left has gone virulently anti-immigration, pro-war, big state spending, everything else. Conservative Party and conservatism has always been pretty hostile to free movement of labour. But in terms of things like immigration, war, welfare, is the public opinion becoming more libertarian-minded, both amongst older generations and younger generations? And what issues do you see that would be most effective in advocating?
Thank you for those 4 questions. I'll start with Harry and work down the line. So from, was it Daniel at the back? From self-confessed working class oik from Dagenham, have you actually, have you done, say, Nietzsche and perhaps others a disservice? Alistair's point was, in order to show libertarianism might work, should some of us go and infiltrate the mafia and show that private provision can be a good thing? Aren't you being self-contradictory as somebody who supports selfishness, giving your time here for free to try and spread the word and educate young people? And what do you think, where Guy's point about, where do you think libertarianism is winning? What are the issues where we're potentially on the verge of scoring some successes?
On Nietzsche and Stirner, I've read, of course, both. I've read The Ego on its own. It's pretty awful. He is the kind of egoist that Ayn Rand is not, and I should have made this clear. Excuse me for not making it clear earlier. Rational selfishness forbids the preying upon or sacrificing other people to yourself. It means that each person respects the individual rights of the other, wants to see the other succeed. It's a very high-minded idea of selfishness. It's not the Stirner model, which is, I want power. If murder is in the offing, I'm for it. He is that's a criminal kind of selfishness. Ayn Rand's heroes are architects or inventors or CEOs, or actually COO of a railroad. They're producers, they're achievers, they're not mafia or the kind of person that Stirner idolizes. Now, Nietzsche is an interesting case because he has many, many good passages. For instance, two that I like, that coldest of cold monsters, the state. And this is another one, from the outset, Christianity spelled life loathing itself. Those are good quotes. But if you look at his whole philosophy, and my friend and colleague John Ridpath has written an essay on this, he is terrible. He is anti-freedom, anti-individualist, Kantian to the core. Why do you think he's beloved by the university faculties today? Because he's an irrationalist. He's fundamentally on the other side. So on a superficial level, and looking at some of his quotes, he sounds terrific, but if you get to his deeper philosophy, he's bad. Now, is there a contradiction? Were you saying, is there a contradiction in my advocating egoism publicly, or is there a contradiction in any egoists wishing other people to be egoists? That's what I thought. There's a philosophical argument that claims there's a contradiction in an egoist wishing another person to be an egoist. I should wish you all to sacrifice yourselves to me. That's completely false. It is against my interest that you be an altruist. I want to write a story about a person who finds himself after a shipwreck in the 19th century on an island where they think he's God, and they give him everything. And the point of it would be to show that it's in his interest to tell them, no, don't do this. Go out and create for your own sake and trade with me. You don't want people who are fawning over you and giving up everything. You want people who are achievers. That's to your self-interest. As Spinoza said, there's nothing more to the interest of a rational being than another rational being. You don't want slaves, serfs, or toadies. You want friends, allies, co-producers, trading partners. So that is completely the opposite of the truth. I spend my life advocating people be egoists because I want them to trade freely with me, not treat me as an object of their sacrifice or as somebody to be sacrificed to them. And the mafia one, I don't endorse the mafia. I don't know what that was about.
I want to pick up on Guy's point about the prospects for public opinion and libertarianism. And I actually think we've never been in a stronger position, or in a really, really good position. And it's quite interesting. I was thinking about the UK Independence Party the other week, and their rise and what have you. And they're filling an interesting niche in some ways where, sometimes they talk about the flat tax and what have you and put a quite compelling case for free markets. They're sort of great freedom lovers and what have you. But what really turns me off them in some ways is when it comes to their stance on their talk about immigration and, tougher border control and what have you. And I think there's a great niche there, and I hope that actually they may fill it at some point perhaps. The sort of niche that people like Douglas Carswell and Dan Hannan, the sort of things that they talk about within the Conservative Party, where you're basically a Eurosceptic because you want the UK to be part of a wider world. You want us to be sort of trading with the fast-growing economies in the world. You want us to go back to being a sovereign nation, but one which works with everybody and not just with the countries closest to us in the European Union. And I think that if the UK Independence Party can actually get their head around that and actually start representing that point of view, it'll be really interesting to see how far they can go.
I'd actually follow on directly from that. I think that at the moment, British public opinion is in a kind of state of flux right now. I'd make two kinds of observations. The first is that I think the social democratic state, which has been the dominant form of politics, and for both parties actually, since the 1940s, with a kind of amendment in the 1980s, is discredited, and it's intellectually vacuous now, which is one of the reasons it explains a lot of the vacuity of a lot of contemporary politics, I think. Now, the question is therefore is, well, which way will things go? And one possible direction is the kind of direction Matthew mentioned, which is a kind of cosmopolitan, outward-looking, limited state, personal responsibility direction. What is the dangerous alternative? Well, I think what we need to fear actually is nationalist politics. The real danger I think we face is the kind of politics that's springing up in many parts of Europe at the moment, and that is a politics that combines support for the welfare state, support for strong intervention by government in the economy with ardent nationalism, anti-globalism, hostility to immigrants. The kind of policies, for example, that the Fidesz government is putting forward in Hungary, which unfortunately got re-elected. I mean, Hungarian politics at the moment are really depressing because not only has Fidesz got elected with a two-thirds majority again on that platform, but the second largest party now in the Hungarian parliament is Jobbik, who are basically Nazis, no qualification to it, that's what they are. So that's the kind of, if you like, I think the kind of politics that we're going to start to see emerging. Now with UKIP, I think it's an interesting question about which way they will go. Will they go in the direction that Matthew hopes they'll go in, which I would hope they'd go in, or are they going to go in the direction of more nationalism? And that's why we have an argument about, for example, what would happen if we were to leave the EU. One of the interesting questions is, do we go down the road of economic nationalism, which the Labour Party was keen on in the 80s, or do we go down the route of becoming a free trade nation once again? So I think that, like I say, we're in a state of flux, which means there's great prizes, but also great risks right now. And as much for the mafia, that strikes me as a high-risk strategy. So for the people who actually engage in it, basically, given the way that disputes and business disagreements are settled in that organisation. So.
I just wanted to come back on one point that he overlooked.
That last one, what's the state? I would like to inform you about the Tea Party, because it's probably being greatly misrepresented here. I know it is in our country. The Tea Party is a very good movement. It is a movement of ordinary people who are more thinking in their direction. It's a movement of people who've read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and have thought about complex political theoretical ideas, and they are not as religious as the regular conservatives. They've tended to keep religion out of their politics, which is a great thing for someone pro-capitalist, and they're damn good. They're not perfect, but they're the first political movement I could endorse since the Gold Order campaign in 1964. So that's a good sign. Also, the decline in labor unions' coercive powers is a good sign it's occurring in my country. There's a movement towards ending the prohibition of marijuana. That's coming. That's a good thing. But in general, I would say the progress is glacially slow. There is progress, but I'm not going to live to see the benefits of it.
We're on the clock, but just before we wrap up, I was going to take Guy's question. I'm afraid we've got to finish in a minute or two. Do try and buttonhole our panelists outside if you want to. And that's on the where is public opinion moving in our direction? And I think that the standout example here in the UK is welfare reform. I'm not entirely sure that the British people, if you like, know what they want. And there may be some ignorant views behind it, a sort of belief that the welfare state is spending money universally on Polish and Bulgarian immigrants. But nevertheless, there is a huge public appetite for welfare reform. When Ian Duncan Smith, the welfare secretary, or the Department of Work and Pensions secretary, effectively the welfare secretary, announced the new government policy that no household would be able to claim more than £26,000 a year in welfare benefits. Not something, by the way, which is going to have a massive downward pressure on the welfare budget, but a kind of moral line in the sand. I know that there were some in the Conservative Party who were worried that this would look like kind of an extreme, mean, tight-fisted, right-wing approach to the world. And the first opinion poll that came out after the announcement showed 78% of the British public supported the welfare cap, and only 9% were opposed to it, 78% in favour and 9% against, which I've searched around for, and until somebody finds a counterexample, I believe is the most popular government policy announced in Britain since opinion polling began. So in welfare reform, I think that we've got the tide of public opinion is moving against the welfare state. They might not know what they want yet or how they want it formed, but they know that what presently exists is unsustainable, morally corrupt, and perhaps directly financially corrupt as well. I'm going to thank our panel, and then I know Anton's going to make an announcement about what the lunch arrangements are. Steve, Matthew, Harry, thank you very much for your thoughts on how we advance liberty. We probably haven't produced the silver bullet. The late, great Chris Tame, who used to be the director of the Libertarian Alliance, said we need libertarians everywhere, in making movies, writing books, in academia, in appearing on the media and whatever, agitating right across the board. And I think Chris was right. And in terms of what works, well, fortunately, at least in the UK, the kind of pro-liberty movement is competitive but friendly. So we're also on a kind of permanent Hayekian discovery process to judge what works and what doesn't. If one of Matthew's organisations starts doing something, I think, that seems to be getting a great rate of return, the IEA will copy it, and he would expect the IEA to copy it, and vice versa. So I hope it will be a process of discovery. So thanks all of you for taking part, and I hope you can join me in thanking Harry, Matthew, and Steve, our panellists. Thank you very much, gentlemen.